Hello, everyone. Welcome. We're going to get started in just a few minutes, but get your lunch ready, get cozy. We'll start in just a few minutes. There's a fun chat happening in the chat box. So if you want to join us there, say hello to all of the panelists and all of the participants. All right, we are going to get started. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Nissy New. I'm the Chief Operating Officer for Metro Dallas Homeless Alliance. And we are well into our series of what kind of community do we want to build. This is our fourth one. So if you haven't watched the previous ones, we encourage you to go and check them out. They're all great content. If you're not aware of what MDHA does, just to bring you up to speed, MDHA is the backbone organization that aligns over 80 to 90 different partners in the community to make homelessness rare, brief, and non-recurring in Dallas and Collin counties. And one aspect of our work is community education and awareness. So for this program specifically, for the Hard Conversation series, we're extremely thankful for Ian Mattingly, the president of the Apartment Association of Greater Dallas, for supporting this initiative. We also encourage you to invest in MDHA. We need your support to do all the really, really big things that we're doing in the community. So you can go to our website and go to donate for any small or large gift you want to make. So with that, I'm going to kick it off and give it to Ian.
Thanks so much, Nissy. And we couldn't be prouder as an apartment association to be supporting these important conversations. But I'm especially thrilled today about the conversation being led by Ashley Brundage. But before I talk about Ashley, which I certainly want to do, I want to talk a little bit about how, as the de facto provider of most of the affordable housing in the Metro Dallas area, members of the Apartment Association of Greater Dallas have long proposed an alternate narrative that is supported by Diana Lind in her groundbreaking book. And so we're very excited to hear from her, puncturing some of the myths about the primacy of single-family housing and talking about some of the ways in which governmental policies and flat-out segregation have, still presented multifamily housing as something less than that primacy of the single family home. So we're very excited about this conversation, and trust me, the members of the Apartment Association of Greater Dallas will be listening with eager ears as Ashley discusses this with Diana. So speaking of Ashley, we really could not ask for a better moderator for this panel today. Ashley's been involved in housing and homelessness issues almost the entirety of her career, the length of which certainly belies her age, but won't go there in my introduction. But she does currently chair the Homeless Collaborative for Dallas and Collin County, and also serves as the Executive Director of Housing Stability and the SVP of Community Impact for the United Way of Metropolitan Dallas. In those roles, she is also chairing the groundbreaking Eviction Prevention Task Force, which I had the privilege to serve on with her. which has done a phenomenal job bringing together constituencies from across the advocacy perspectives to really put in place concrete solutions to help out with the crisis moment that we're having in light of COVID and many of the economic impacts that are related to COVID. So could not be more grateful for her efforts on all of those fronts, and also on bringing us this hard conversation today. So with that, I will turn it over to Ashley.
Thank you so much, Ian. So I'm so excited to be here for this conversation with Diana today, and I want to give a brief introduction of who she is and why we're talking to her today, in case you haven't had the chance to read her book. So Diana Lind is a writer and urban policy specialist. Diana's worked at Architectural Record Magazine, Next City, the Philadelphia Inquirer, and the University of Pennsylvania. She currently leads the Arts and Business Council for Greater Philadelphia, where her work fosters an exchange between the creative and business communities. And she serves as the VP of Community and Culture for the Chamber of Commerce for Greater Philadelphia. So today we get to talk to her about her book, Brave New Home, Our Future in Smarter, Simpler, Happier Housing, which was published last year in October. Diana's book, Brave New Home, is one of those invaluable books that offers a new view on our affordable housing crisis. It pushes one to rethink the way we build homes now, to make major policy changes and reinvent how we build communities and housing, or else we'll continue to see unaffordable, segregated, and unsustainable neighborhoods. So Diana, I want to welcome you to Hard Conversations today. Again, I'm so excited to talk to you, and I just have to say I so enjoyed your book.
Thank you so much, Ashley, and thank you so much for having me here. It's a real honor to be speaking with this group.
I know we have a lot of things to discuss. We had a very good prep call, but so I'm going to jump right into it. So, as you know, our mission here with the Homeless Collaborative and Metro Dallas Homeless Alliance is to make homelessness rare, brief, and non-recurring. We envision a community where everyone has access to safe, decent, affordable housing. And what struck me about your book in this respect is that it reinforces the idea that homelessness is at its core a man-made housing problem. One of your central assertions is that the promotion of a single-family home as the American dream is the source of many of our housing problems, including homelessness. I would love for you to tell us some more about that.
Sure, yeah. So in the book, I talk a lot about this idea of how the American dream, which is, a dream in which housing, single-family homes really are a source of wealth creation, of privacy, of stability, of family unity. How, we still hold these values dear, but in many cases, that sort of dream and the reality in which we're living in has really become disjointed and disconnected in a lot of different ways. And, I think we can talk a little bit more about how the sort of idea of the American dream came to be, but really it's been sort of this steadfast part of our culture for the past 100 years or so. And single family homes are a big part of that, in the sense that as we've built our communities around this idea of this American dream, that there's a number of different kinds of kind of zoning requirements and other types of requirements that have really kind of propped up this type of housing in a way that is that makes it more expensive, that makes it less sort of communal or interdependent, that makes it less environmentally sustainable than I think that we would like it to be. So, just to give a couple of examples of that, in many cases, single family homes are sort of like the least efficient and most expensive kind of housing to build. It's, often built on lots that are, at least a quarter of an acre, in houses that have to be, at least 1,500 square feet, have at least one garage, and all of these kinds of requirements add to the cost of housing, and they sort of artificially raise the cost of living. At the same time, there are many people who kind of can't buy into that whole package. They can really sort of only afford, say, 200 square feet. But that's not legal in many parts of the country, in many neighborhoods that we live in. And so therefore it's not a possibility. And so ways in which this kinds of contributes to homelessness, I would say, is that, for many people, a job loss or an illness or a youth getting kicked out of their home, they have very few options in which there is sort of affordable housing that is kind of convenient and available to them. In many cases, the only options in many neighborhoods are really those single family homes that are out of price range for many people. And so, I think that there's been this idea that of an American dream that we all are sort of striving for, but at the same time, it's sort of become very difficult in terms of the sort of social, economic, and environmental consequences of it.
Right. And in your book, you talk about how we were kind of conditioned to think this way, right? So, we have people right now who are thinking, well, of course it's the American dream. It's what we all want to have. We all want our own home. We all want our yard for our kids and our pets to play in, but it hasn't always been that way, right? So how did we get here?
Yeah. So, definitely, before there was zoning, there were a lot of many more diverse housing options. So in the 1700s and the 1800s, the ways that people lived were, first of all, much more multi-generationally. People often lived in sort of boarding houses or kind of more temporary situations. That was very common. I think something like in the 1800s, somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of city dwellers were at some point a boarder themselves or had housed boarders at some point in their homes. There were also a lot of other different housing types, whether they were apartment hotels or SROs, much more common tenements, other different styles of housing that were much more common 1700s, 1800s, early 1900s. This idea of building the American dream really started to prop up actually at the time of the last pandemic, if you will. In 1918, kind of around the end of World War I, when the country was really starting to think about a number of different issues around housing, around sort of standardizing housing, lowering the cost of housing. This really got accelerated, especially with the Great Depression and coming out of World War II. Throughout this period of time, as a mechanism both to kind of to address some of the concerns of overcrowding, say, in cities, and encourage kind of a suburban lifestyle, there's a quite immense kind of media campaign around owning your own home and the ways in which that would make you sort of, morally superior. And when I've given talks with slideshows, I have old examples of, media where it says, you're a better father, husband, and American citizen if you own your own home. And so I think these are a lot of ideas that have really kind of stuck with us since then, and combined with government policies that really sort of encourage homeowning, have made it in many ways this kind of American dream or the better option for people.
So really this idea around owning our own home, single family housing is almost like a stumbling block for us to be able to then create the affordable housing, the multi-housing that we need to see in our community right now. So how do we kind of overcome that perception that we all need to have our own home, that this is the end goal in your life, I guess, your homeowning life?
Yeah, well, I think just as quickly as there are, trends that kind of come to be in one direction, the pendulum can swing in a different direction, right? So I know we'll probably talk a little bit about alternatives to single family homes, but things like, for example, co-living have become much more trendy by virtue of the fact that that it's been kind of popularized, and there are companies posting, pictures on Instagram of what it's like to live in a co-living environment. And that sort of changes people's perspective of like, oh, shared living, isn't that sort of like either for hippies or people who can't afford their own place or what have you. I think likewise, there are ways in which we can also change some of the dialogue ourselves and ways in which we view things like, for example, multi-generational housing. So oftentimes, living with kin, whether it's our parents or family members, is kind of called doubling up. There are ways in which I think it's just sort of been part of our culture to kind of frown upon living with family members or people even outside your family within your home. So I think that, it's going to require a bit of narrative change, but we've certainly seen ways in which narrative change have swept the country over the past couple of decades as well. And so I think attention to it is part of the answer there.
And that's interesting that you bring up the point around narrative change, because I feel like one of the important kind of designs in housing is the single resident occupancy, that SRO model that we had back in the 70s, that as we've moved forward with this narrative around the single family home and advanced just as a nation, that got left behind, and we don't really do that type of housing anymore. Talk to me a little bit about, or the audience a little bit about, how you see that coming back and what kind of models are happening now, and even some more about why they went away.
Sure, yeah. So, I think single room occupancy homes really are in some ways kind of like an outgrowth of that kind of boarding home style housing type that was very popular, or even the apartment hotel, which was also really popular at like the end of the 1800s, early 1900s. SROs kind of, had none of the sort of hotel amenities or maybe some of the kind of pleasantries that you maybe would have in a boarding house, but really were just kind of functional single room occupancy types of housing. They, in many cases, just sort of disappeared over time as they became outlawed and sort of became illegal in many parts of cities, and they became that way because of changes to licenses and inspections or zoning, that sort of thing. That, in many cases this was extremely affordable housing, and in many cases people don't want people who are living in extremely affordable housing in their neighborhood, right? And so especially as I think they became sort of illegal and existing in the shadows, then I think many times SROs started to become seen as dangerous. And in some cases they were, because you could have, fires with these buildings not being up to code and people dying in those fires and so on. So I think that's sort of, a bit of the history of kind of where SROs ended up. And in many cases also the smaller SROs would get turned into single family homes and gentrifying neighborhoods when a single family home was worth more than, a multi-unit building. I think that nowadays there's sort of a lot of cities are starting to think about how could we embrace this housing type as a type of very affordable housing for people, because it's extremely efficient. If we find a way to get SROs up to code, that could be incredibly useful. And it also wouldn't require the same kinds of, say, subsidies that you might need to build other types of affordable housing that have, more wraparound services or other kinds of amenities and so on. So I know Philadelphia, where I live, they had been looking into ways of addressing some of the code issues and really trying to bring some of the ones out of the shadows and enabling new SROs as well.
That's great. I like that you mentioned subsidies too. So, we often think that when we buy our own house that we've made it, and it's entirely a product of our own choices, of our own hard work. Unlike where you look at, housing for our neighbors experiencing homelessness, affordable housing, even folks who just are homeless, that people look at as it's all government supported, it's a charity, things like that. But really, you talk about how we're wrong in those thoughts. Can you describe for us some of the different ways that the federal government actually props up single family housing through different types of subsidies?
Sure, yeah. There's a couple of different ways that I'd say we encourage single family homes and also discourage people co-residency. So and the government is doing that. So the primary one I would say is the mortgage interest deduction. That is a fantastic incentive for homeowners. And many of the people who are benefiting from that are people who are, whose, their gross income is over $100,000, right? So not your, sort of average middle class, working class, or lower class person, but sort of the upper echelons of society are really kind of reaping the benefit of this, of much of the mortgage interest deduction. So that's one case in which it's kind of, there's unequal subsidy happening there, but subsidy for anyone really with that, and not anything really comparable to renters in some kind of rental subsidy. Another way, and this is sort of more mild, would be, a lot of the different types of government benefits from things like Social Security or SNAP food benefits. Those are calculated based off of who you live with, what the total income is of your household. And so, for example, receiving free food and shelter reduces the amount of Social Security that you could get. So if you're a grandparent who has moved in with your family, you're sort of disincentivized from doing that by Social Security. And likewise, for a SNAP benefit, if you're a single parent looking after 2 kids, there's a certain income threshold that you would meet to get, your SNAP benefits. But if you're living with other family members who are contributing to the overall household income, you would get essentially less money because you have these sort of other resources there. So I think that there are a lot of ways in which, we have not embraced the idea of, first of all, of encouraging the kind of like multi-generational living that many other countries do embrace. Places from Asia to Europe really encourage that. And we've also really kind of not thought about, we don't really openly talk about the subsidies that we give to homeowners or have a kind of discussion about all the money that is lost in that kind of tax incentive, in the same way that we might have discussions about subsidizing affordable housing.
Right. And then your example of like the mom with kids living with family, it's almost punishing her for making a smart decision to try and share the rent burden or whatever that might be there. It's just frustrating.
Yeah.
So switching topics a little bit. So you and I talked in our little prep session about how your husband and I are both working in the emergency rental assistance realm, trying to get the $45 billion out into the hands of renters right now, which has proven to be more difficult than getting assistance to homeowners. Let's talk a little bit about why that is and what you think we can do to improve on that for our next inevitable crisis.
Yeah, well, I would certainly welcome your thoughts on this after I give a couple of thoughts. But I mean, I think sort of having witnessed this sort of secondhand, I guess, many cities are really creating these rental assistance programs on the fly. This is a completely new thing led by people who've never done this before, creating entirely new systems, building new distribution channels, having whole new sets of protocols for paperwork and all of that. So this has been really challenging for cities to kind of go from 0 to 60 over this time period super fast, without some of the maybe benefits of, say, the private sector and being able to mobilize super quickly. At the same time, certainly banks have been in the business of dealing with mortgages, issuing them, trying to prevent foreclosures, for a very long time. So those channels have been open and established. They have, protocols for doing that. So I think it's been much easier for, say, a homeowner who is experiencing, trouble and saying, I'm at risk of foreclosing, to talk to their bank and be mediated at that point, versus, having to develop entirely new from scratch rental assistance programs. I think in terms of the idea of thinking about how can we use this infrastructure going forward, it's such an interesting question. And I think that there have been new relationships built between municipalities and landlords and tenants. And just think about, how that could potentially be exploited for good in terms of, thinking about, there are programs, for example, like low interest loans to repair properties, or to, do mold remediation, or to do, environmental sustainability projects. Like we now have built up all these different connections and have a way of accessing these folks that we hadn't had before. And not to mention, potential future crises that like there's been an infrastructure built here that could be leverage going forward. But yeah, I'm curious to know what you think about it.
Well, I think just to add on to that, we've created so many partnerships and collaborations through this crisis, just everybody trying to work together to help the community out, that we can't lose those partnerships because we're filling in gaps that each other has, right? So we can lean on each other to help create something that maybe we can't do during that time. And I've seen a lot of that happening, but you're very correct with the kind of linkages between nonprofits and landlord associations. Ian is a great example. He and the team at the Apartment Association of Greater Dallas have been joining task force calls. They've been joining strategy calls where beforehand those conversations weren't as active as what you see now. And so I think it's really important for us to continue those relationships and those partnerships and continue to support the infrastructure that we've put in place so that people who are facing evictions have a place to turn to moving forward even when we're past the crisis.
Yeah.
So in the work of the Homeless Collaborative and MDHA, we prioritize and infuse anti-racist policy into everything we do. And I know we talked about this a little bit too, about how going back to homeowners getting assistance quicker than renters, how one of the first things the federal government did was provide a year's worth of assistance to homeowners, and renters could only access 3 months at a time. Like just that in itself is a racist policy coming out of our federal government. And we continue to see that today. We know it's happened in the past. I think people sometimes forget about how zoning has its roots in racism and segregation. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, yeah.
Redlining and all of that.
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, I think zoning initially came from perhaps a place of concerns over public health, right? Of ensuring that people had adequate access to air and light and other things to ensure that their homes were healthy and safe. And with this idea of finding ways to kind of keep separate some of the types of functions that you might find in a city, so that you don't have, an environmental waste plant going up right next to a park and a set of homes, and keeping, residential, commercial, and agricultural uses separate. You could also look at these kinds of moves as ways of kind of restricting who lives where, and especially as residential zoning essentially became single family home zoning, it made it very clear who could afford to live in certain neighborhoods, right? So when I initially was talking about sort of minimum lot sizes and minimum house sizes, that really prescribes who can actually afford to live in that neighborhood. And so you have, many people of color that not able to afford living in those neighborhoods. But in addition to that, you mentioned redlining, and this was sort of a practice that was sanctioned essentially starting in the 1930s and really continuing in various forms of, legal or not legal forms for a while of, kind of systematically denying services to people of color, Jewish people, other minorities, in various different neighborhoods. So, a series of, now infamous maps were created after the Great Depression to sort of assess the risk of certain neighborhoods for investing in these new federal mortgage products. And the ones that were kind of deemed unsafe were the ones that were, entirely inhabited by people of color or partially inhabited by people of color. And still to this day, though we don't have those kinds of racial restrictions, we do have restrictions on whether you can get, an FHA loan for an apartment, say, in a building that is primarily occupied by renters. There has to be sort of a certain threshold of how many homeowners are in a building to get an FHA loan. So there's a number of different ways in which those redlining maps have, there have been studies and articles recently as well about this, how those neighborhoods that were historically redlined have continued to not have the same kind of financial advantages, investment, even, tree canopy and street cover, even years after it was no longer legal to kind of practice this kind of redlining. So I think that, there's a legacy there that is still there, decades later. And, we can talk about how things have changed, but I think we also really need to admit that there's these legacies that are really still, dramatically affecting the outcomes of certain neighborhoods, the incomes, and the sort of racial segregation that is still, continued to be really difficult to bridge.
Yeah, I think, I know for sure over the past at least 5 years plus, we've heard a lot about redlining in Dallas. So my guess is most of the audience is very familiar with the maps and the segregation that it caused here. And it's unfortunate that it still reverberates. What kind of zoning changes have you seen that are kind of promising practices? Because I know you're not familiar enough with Dallas to speak to our zoning here, but are promising practices that can help us move past some of that?
Right.
Knowing that zoning and housing alone cannot answer and repair the damage that has been done by that segregation, but like, how can we start to push forward there?
Well, I think as a starting point, just a more diverse housing stock is going to enable a more diverse set of people to live within it. So again, if you look at that kind of monolithic neighborhood of, certain size house, certain size yard, et cetera, like that really means you have a certain price point that you need to be able to hit to enter that particular neighborhood. But if you start to have multifamily buildings that have apartments that are smaller, that may not have access to the backyard, they might be more affordable. That might bring in a different set of people to a neighborhood and a more diverse neighborhood. Just naturally, it's going to bring in different incomes, different folks. So I think that, just as a starting point, kind of moving beyond the single family home as the single type of zoning is really important. A lot of people have, as a sort of first step, really been fond of the idea of accessory dwelling unit reform. So the idea that you can add to a single family home an apartment, you could add a backyard cottage. And this is an interesting way of, adding potentially more affordable housing without really changing the character of a neighborhood. So, it's not, people get very nervous when you say multifamily buildings in a, single family home neighborhood. But you can add housing stock this way. And I think it's also especially exciting when you think about like new construction, really having that built in from scratch. There's really great ways to design that in there. So I think that those are a couple of, just small tweaks, obviously, to get to like much larger issues of segregation. I think we also have to think about like, how do our public school systems play into this, and where we have, public school catchments set aside, and what are the, public transportation opportunities. There's a much larger set of issues, but sort of those, I think that to start addressing allowing for more diverse housing types would be a huge step towards like more diverse neighborhoods.
Well, so let's talk about the ADUs for a minute. So, in your book, you cover extensively alternative housing options to the single family housing, but you do spend quite a bit of time on the ADUs and talking about how, they are used to create more affordable housing, but it doesn't always turn out that way. Talk a little bit about that, because I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a promising housing type that, especially as technology changes, like there's a lot of talk, there has been, and I think will continue to be, around ideas of, say, even 3D printed homes or prefab homes that are very easy to build into backyards, or garage transformations into apartments, and ways in which that can be done almost with an IKEA kit of parts. So I think there's ways in which this could potentially be a really interesting source of affordable housing if we can figure out ways to get the housing costs low. It's also really interesting because it's private owners often who are building accessory dwelling units, right? So it doesn't require, once the municipality allows it in the zoning, they don't have to pay for it. And so for people who are, against paying for, affordable housing or affordable housing subsidies, this is a way of sort of getting the private sector, if you will, to pay for it. The challenge of getting it to actually be affordable is that if you're, first of all, most of the people who are going to be building accessory dwelling units are folks who are already well capitalized and savvy about construction, and and so if they go through all the trouble of building their backyard cottage, it's pretty likely that, they're not, unless they're very altruistic, they're not going to be building this backyard cottage for, say, a low-income person or below market rate. They're going to be using it as, maybe a guest cottage or an Airbnb. Not to say that it's not a bad idea to be able to, they oftentimes will also be used to house loved ones, right? And that's taking one person out of the demand side. So that's, even offering it for free, that's a really a good thing. But I think that's part of the big challenge, is thinking about, how can you get a more inclusive group of homeowners to actually start building the accessory dwelling units in the first place, having the wherewithal to do that. And so in the book, I give the example of a project in Los Angeles, which was trying to do exactly this, which was, to partner with particularly like immigrant communities that had, sort of built-in equity in their homes, to build accessory dwelling units and to find a sort of way to have a one-stop shop. Like, you just go to one nonprofit organization, they get you the contractor, they get you the loan, all this kind of stuff. So you don't have to have you don't have to be your own homegrown developer to build an accessory dwelling unit. The problem is that it's a time-consuming and difficult process, and how many of these units are going to get built anyway. That being said, what's happened in California is super interesting, and a lot throughout the West Coast, that, just allowing accessory dwelling units has encouraged, I don't have the exact statistic, but it's like more than 100% increase in permits being pulled for accessory dwelling units. So there is demand for it, and it's getting filled. And it may not be, hundreds of thousands of units, but it's thousands of units being built each year.
Right. And it might not be on the affordable end where you're targeting somebody who is experiencing homelessness, but it's still good for the younger generation who's just starting off in their career. It's affordable to them, right? Which is still what's needed, because, across the nation, we're still seeing that like missing middle of housing as well, right?
Right. And I mean, I think one of the exciting things about accessory dwelling units is also just how it adds, again, this idea of flexibility to, to your home, right? So it could be that you're building an accessory dwelling unit that is for your 20-something who's, coming back from college and you wants a little privacy, but wants to still live in your house and with you. That could be a good start, but maybe then, 20 years later, it's the grandparents' time to live in the cottage, or maybe that becomes the caretakers, like a person who at home caretaker for an elderly person. So there's a lot of different ways in which the accessory dwelling units could end up being, adding more flexibility and more housing options that just simply wouldn't be in many neighborhoods without that kind of, backyard cottage or apartment unit.
Right. I love it. I love it for the kind of multi-generational living. I know, even my mom right now is considering how to incorporate a mother-in-law suite into her new house because grandma needs to not be living on her own anymore.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So even those types of options, I know you explored how to incorporate that into housing a little bit more. Do you want to talk about that some too? Because that was a interesting way too.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the big challenges that we're facing just with all of our housing is kind of like, how do we retrofit this housing type to fit the needs that people have today, whether it is, the in-law suite, or it's, a home office or whatever it might end up being. For a lot of people, the expense and difficulty of, kind of doing this from scratch is too much. And so I think that also points to, again, the need for this more diverse housing stock. Because it's like, if you had a duplex and not, that immediately works for, someone who wants their own apartment, but also needs, a family member living nearby or whatever it might end up being, but living within the same unit. And I think that, we're starting to see some momentum from home builders in accepting this and trying to think through, like, what does multi-generational living look like? But I'm sort of adding to the drumbeat that we need to be doing more of it. I think, we were talking about racism and classism. And I think a lot of the reason why that multi-generational housing hasn't been a bigger topic is because who is typically has been living multi-generationally. It's often people of color, it's often immigrants. White people do it too, but it's more prevalent in those communities. And I think that they haven't been catered to in the same way. And I think that's a shame, but I think it's also starting to, change, especially as COVID has also, brought attention to the fact of so many families kind of coming together to, access, whether it's, economic resources or social resources, just being in a pod together. And I think that's really made a lot of people aware of, like, hey, this actually wouldn't be so bad living together, but we can't do it with just one bathroom or whatever it might end up being. Like, there have to be ways of addressing this with housing types.
Well, and talk about that some more, because you and I talked about, like, the deterioration of just community and what that means for us as a nation. And you referenced Bowling Alone in your book, which is a book I read a long time ago. But talk a little bit more about how the importance of community and what are people doing to kind of bring that back into their lives, besides, like, the pod educations that we've seen during COVID.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that for a lot of people, trying to find ways of accessing a more intentional community has become more and more attractive. And, I started the book talking about how, this was like pre-pandemic, before I had experienced, stay-at-home orders. But, basically, having a newborn and feeling like I was in a stay-at-home order for a while, and how that was like my first experience as someone who was really at home so much of the time. And it had, and made me wonder, like, why don't I live in some kind of place where I'm constantly accessing other mothers, and, we're making dinners for each other, and we've got, we're all sharing the toys and whatever else it might end up being. But instead, we're all sort of in our own houses, separate from one another. And it's not that easy to build that community. And so I think a lot of people are feeling that way. And when I say a lot of people, it's still, a fraction of our, overall country. But I look at in the book things ranging from co-living communities, which are very much about, having these shared experiences, whether it's, happy hours or communal meals, to things like Serenbe outside of Atlanta, which is a wellness community, which, is all about, having, community supported agriculture and, shared public resources like trails and pools and outside spaces and things like that. And so it's really kind of a way of rethinking, the way in which single family homes have always been about producing some degree of privacy, and instead saying, how can I have housing that encourages the opposite of privacy, that kind of like, that community, that chance to build relationships or do things. So yeah.
How do we get to know our neighbors again?
Yeah.
Okay, so switching topics a little bit, you mentioned briefly at the very beginning of this, but I'm going to bring it up again about the impact that single family housing has had on our climate. So the UN just issued a code red due to climate change. And you talk a bit about not just how the development of single family housing kind of hits our environment, but also like how we could be helping living in shared housing. So tell us some more about that.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think getting back to, this idea of, what are our most efficient forms of housing? Single family homes are not an efficient use of our resources. They're, by virtue of the fact that they're often sited far away from one another, it requires everyone to, not everyone, but many people to have a car or two cars to access their daily needs, adding to the sort of carbon, output that everyone is kind of producing. As opposed to, let's say, a more kind of communal style of living, which would allow people to kind of share in more of their resources. So, to share, whether it's, appliances like in your kitchen or bathrooms, to having some of those kind of shared spaces and not having to take up so much space. And I think that beyond that kind of issue of density, there's sort of a larger question of like where we're siting single family homes. Our development patterns have really kind of pushed many communities into nature in ways in which we're really now seeing nature push back, whether it's, in wildfires or flooding. It's just, we've gotten too close to those edges of nature. And so it's really become, in that term, unsustainable, because it's not possible to keep on pushing further and further out. So we're going to have to think about, how do we build inward? How do we have that more infill style of development? What does that look like? And how can we do that well? And I think that kind of gets back to this idea of the American dream, is like, how do we rethink that as living well? Living well might be being able to walk to everything that you need to get to in a given day. It might be, feeling good about the fact that you're sharing resources rather than everyone having their own stuff. So yeah, that's a little bit, yeah.
Sorry, and living further in and being able to walk to things, right? Because we don't have, in most places when you're out in the suburbs, you don't have the ability, unless you're going to walk for 2 hours, right, or whatever. You can't do that, and it does impact your health. Not only the mobility aspect of it, but just being around people, not experiencing loneliness. You talk about that some in your book. And multiple studies have shown that homelessness impacts one's life expectancy as well. So tell me a little bit more about the health impacts that you describe in the book, and how the alternative models help there as well.
Sure. Yeah. So I think that there's, a range of different types of health impacts. So there's this sort of social and mental health impact of having a sense of community and being able to build that. And I can't tell you how many times I've had done a radio show, or I've done an interview, and someone says, I love my neighborhood and I have good neighbors and we have a real community. And that is totally true. For many people, they have been able to build relationships within, neighborhoods of single family homes. But for a lot of other people, the sort of the distance, the lack of shared spaces, it can be socially isolating. So that's one aspect of it. And I think that, the sort of data bears out that Americans do feel increasingly lonely. And that might be, a result of the, internet environment that we're in, that, if I were in Dallas today, I would be, we'd all be, together in person if we were, in non-COVID times or whatnot, and we'd be able to build social connections that way. But I think that increasingly as our lives go online, there's, a degree of loneliness. And so, a lot of people are starting to think about, how can we address loneliness through housing types? And I give an example of a project called Nesterly, which was created by someone who had come out of MIT and was trying to address both social isolation and affordability through one project, which is connecting seniors with, college students or grad students, by providing them with a spare bedroom. And they provide rent, but they also often provide, help putting in that AC unit or whatever it might end up being around the house. And that has kind of, gone beyond that initial concept. But I think there are a lot of different ways in which we could have housing options that better encourage social interaction. That is one. Certainly co-living is one. Some of the other intentional communities. On the other side of just sort of the health impacts, there's ways in which, as you mentioned, it's difficult to walk around, to do a ton of walking in your, daily environment in a lot of purely residential neighborhoods. There are, a lot of studies around issues, being near, the importance of being able to access, other sources of physical exercise, just whether it's, neighborhood parks and whatnot. So there are more kind of wellness communities that are oriented around gardening or around almost like rec centers rather than necessarily just a grouping of housing. And I think, to get lastly to your point about homelessness and the connection there between homelessness and health, we've seen hospitals that have looked at, the homeless that have come into their emergency rooms and realized that the sort of best prescription for their recovery is not to see them in the ER, but to actually furnish them with housing. And that this could be, a real great way to show actually the health benefits of housing, particularly for the homeless, of just having a stable home can really be a huge benefit. And it works for their sort of bottom line too, right? Because it's less expensive for them to actually build the housing than service them in an ER room.
It helps all of our bottom line when they're going to the county hospital.
Right.
And that's really why I would say United Way, where I work, has taken a big step forward into this space too, is because, our overall goals are in education, income, and health, but we're never going to be successful there until we get somebody into a home where they have a roof over their head each night. They know where they're going to sleep. They're able to shower for work. This child has a place to study. It's important, and it makes a huge difference in someone's life, but it just makes financial sense for these hospitals and health insurance companies to get more involved into this space as well. I'm going to switch topics again.
Sure.
So throughout the book, we talk about how housing and homelessness crisis we face as a systemic problem resulting from bad policy. Laws, rules, incentives are lopsided in favor of single-family housing. We've talked about that some, but why can't we solve this problem without changes to policy?
Yeah, so I think there are necessary policy changes at kind of like every level. There are ways in which you could address it locally through things particularly like zoning. And then, federally, when you think about sort of like how we're incentivizing what type of housing we have, at the state level, it might end up being more like, changes to how we're thinking about even infrastructure, like our transportation, our streets, whatnot, how we're organizing our communities around that. All those various different factors come into play. And it's been very interesting actually to see states where there's been zoning reform and how that has really also kind of enabled especially sort of smaller communities that don't have the kind of like, full-fledged zoning office to deal with these kinds of issues, really help them address some of these concerns. So, like in Oregon and Washington, there have been a lot of statewide reforms around housing that have really helped push that along. But yeah, I mean, I think that, I talk a lot in the book about, frankly, like more private side changes, because I feel like there's sometimes ways in which the private sector can be moving along changes faster than policymakers are able to pick up on it, but also because you need to demonstrate demand. And to demonstrate and to get to the demand point, you also frankly need sort of pilot projects that are going to get people excited about these kinds of alternatives. So I think that, like we do definitely need policy changes, no doubt about it. And that's sort of like the end goal. But I think it has to be done in conjunction with sort of like civic and private leaders also.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how you experience that as well, like sort of coming from the civic side and what you're pushing for in policymakers.
I think we see that a lot, where your philanthropic community, your private community has to kind of pilot something or push something forward before you can see then the policy change to happen. Like it's almost like we have to convince the government that this is the right way to do this, or this is really going to be successful before they'll get behind it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think you're spot on right there. I wanted you to hit onto the example that you give in Minneapolis as an exciting example of how we can solve our national housing crisis through policy change. Can you tell the audience what they did and what the results were there?
Sure. Yeah. So, Minneapolis embarked on essentially like a citywide envisioning process of trying to think about, what do we want our city to look like in 2030, 2035, going forward. And really, as they started to think about, a bunch of different issues, whether it was, a more sustainable place, a less segregated place, a more place where there would be more transportation options, more affordable place. All these various different factors really centered around this issue of changing the housing zoning. And so people call it a ban on single family zoning. It's not actually that. It's essentially reversing the way that many neighborhoods had set up their zoning laws. So in many cases, what you could build by right was single family homes, and everything else requires a variance. Instead, now you can build anything but single family homes. You can build a single family home and anything on top of that up to a fourplex essentially on a lot. It's got a lot of attention because it was really sort of the first big city to do this and to really sort of give, such carte blanche. But there have also been a lot of complaints about how there's still a number of remaining restrictions around things like FAR, so how tall the building is going to be on the lot, and various other different requirements that haven't really enabled, like every lot to be turned into more multifamily housing. So I think that there have been some other examples, even say like some kind of missing middle reforms in Portland that have been seen as kind of more nuanced, that might enable more different types of housing based on their kind of current zoning laws. But I think that the critical thing about Minneapolis was also sort of like building that community excitement and dialogue around these issues, and kind of also recognizing that this was one tool to address so many different things, like and one really strong way to actually start, solving a lot of these problems.
Do you think that helped kind of push back against the NIMBYism groups that exist, right? Because
I mean, I think to some degree. I mean, I think that the key thing here being that it's not just about housing. It's about, making a place that's sustainable. It's about all these values around, having a more integrated city. If we're actually really honest and serious about these kinds of issues, we've got to be addressing them. And here's a tool for doing that. Whereas I think a lot of the kind of NIMBY, YIMBY sort of debates end up in a lot of questions over, is this, project, is this going to gentrify my neighborhood, or is there enough parking, or whatever? And it's sort of like, let's keep our eye on these sort of bigger goals rather than questioning, project by project, whether this is an appropriate, development or not.
Well, that almost gets back to what you were talking around the need for the narrative change. Instead of talking about how we need more homes for those experiencing homelessness, let's look at an overall picture of what do we want our community to look like. We want all types of people living with us. Otherwise, we don't have the diverse community that we all want to live in and learn from one another and rely on one another. I think that's really important that we figure out what that not perfect, but narrative change is to really push forward.
Right. Yeah. And I think also just one other, thought is that when they sort of set out on this visioning process, it wasn't necessarily like they knew that the end goal was going to be changing single family zoning in the city, but that seemed like a natural outcome of it. And so that may also, that kind of visioning process might not always lead to this same solution or ultimate result, but it will feel authentic if it's sort of produced by the community nonetheless. And some part of it may not be the same exact kind of zoning reform, but I think that
well, you're bringing all the voices to the table, not just those that are the loudest or the most connected. And that's important. So we're getting a lot of questions and comments in the chat box, but before I open it up to some of the audience questions, what's something that we haven't talked about yet that you wanted to be sure to mention?
Gosh, I guess I feel like we covered a lot of these various different topics. We touched on them a little bit. I mean, I feel like everyone had a lot of the questions I got after this book came out in October were like, how has COVID changed your opinion on this? Because this really has been this period of, a lot of people talking about people leaving cities for, suburban environments, or really kind of retreating to their single family homes. And I totally get that, especially as, things can be very scary with COVID, and there are reasons for staying at home. But I really do believe ultimately, and we saw this even in the kind of brief period before this Delta variant really became an issue, that there was a lot of picking up on a lot of these same ideas, just as there had been beforehand. So things like co-living environments. There were so many people who throughout this experience are single, who had been living very in tremendous isolation, who recognize that they would much rather live in a co-living environment where they have a built-in social structure and sort of a built-in pod as part of that. And I think likewise things like multi-generational housing, which were increasingly popular pre-COVID, is only going to become more popular afterwards. And I think finally the sort of idea of how do you infuse housing with some kind of health directive as part of it, as kind of solving for health rather than just sort of solving for housing. I think that is only going to become a bigger issue going on afterwards. So I think a lot of these trends that had started pre-COVID are kind of continuing, well, as COVID is continuing, but are kind of, I think will continue more afterwards as well.
We'll see them grow some, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's COVID's been good and bad, right, in many cases, but it's definitely highlighted for more people the housing crisis that we are in as a nation, and in what like kind of fragile spaces people are in before a huge crisis like this hits, and how do we help prevent that in the future? I mean, I don't think that we've had as many eyes looking at affordable housing and homelessness as we have had during this past year and a half. So I think you're right there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Definitely going to grow. All right, so David, are you asking the questions from Q&A, or do I pull them?
Other questions? Oops, sorry. Mic back down there. Myself. So if people do have questions, please put them in the Q&A and we will try to answer them. Did pick up a couple that went into the chat, and so let's see if we can address these. So the first question is, you know, Dallas is not Minneapolis. What are some like low-hanging fruit zoning changes that we could possibly, you know, do in Dallas? Because we're probably not gonna, you know, even though probably like Ashley and I would love it, you know, we're probably not going to do the Minneapolis thing tomorrow. So what's some low-hanging fruit that we could kind of go for, Diana?
Yeah, I mean, so, and actually there was a little bit of a few questions about this in our prep about, you know, sort of conservative liberal approaches on housing. And I mean, it's actually sort of, you know, it's kind of strange that you would think a sort of a conservative viewpoint being that let people build what they want on their property, right? Like, why do we have all these restrictions around single family homes? And so there, and it sort of seems strange that the cities that are kind of, you know, liberalizing their, you know, housing options are kind of these more typical liberal cities and whatnot. And so I guess I think that the lowest hanging fruit, I think, are some of these kind of small tweaks to the single family home, right? So it would be things like accessory dwelling units as being, you know, allowing accessory dwelling units, making them more easy for folks to implement with, you know, having fewer restrictions around size, parking requirements, et cetera. Those would be some of the sort of low-hanging fruit in cities. I think also thinking about, you know, how to encourage, you know, other options in terms of potentially adapting older buildings to things like co-living or shared living opportunities, or things like SROs. Like those are things that I think could be encouraged in ways with, you know, an excited sort of developer community, rather than necessarily having to build kind of a groundswell of people who are interested in it. But I mean, I can say also, like, in Philadelphia, where I am, I'm part of a coalition that's trying to get more people excited about accessory dwelling units, and it's really been launched by the by AARP, that's trying to build a kind of political coalition around this as kind of an issue for seniors. And I think that the sort of maybe even the lowest hanging fruit is actually coalition building, and thinking about, like, who are some of the partners that need to kind of come to the table around thinking about housing choices in the first place, and kind of getting that group together and starting that dialogue. So
it's interesting that AARP is stepping into it, especially considering, you know, the aging of our population and the sandwich generation that you're hearing about. Like, we might see more and more ADUs come about because more and more people are going to start demanding it as an option. So that's an interesting way to start approaching it, though, for sure.
That really caught my eye, the AARP thing. I was like, oh, they're like very powerful.
It also has like a really a broad base of constituents, right? Like that's the whole, you know, like that cuts across a lot of different types of communities, and also have, it's a group that has a lot of important relationships with kind of political officials and whatnot. So I think that thinking about those kinds of coalitions and like who can get behind them, environmental groups, transportation groups, things like that. There's, developers, bring them all together into conversation is going to be important.
David, I like the question from Traz in the chat box. Can I ask that?
Yeah, totally. Go for it.
Okay. So how do you get private developer demand from marginalized or low income populations? How do we address the economics of zoning changes and development interests?
Okay, sorry, can you repeat that one again? So it's,
yeah.
so the first question was around, how do you get developers excited about building for marginalized communities? Yeah. And I mean, I think actually what's happening right now is there's been a lot of developer interest in sort of naturally occurring affordable housing, because it is, it's not the luxury housing category that has been kind of saturated. It's not the sort of complicated capital stack that maybe you need to build for affordable housing. It's something that's different. And actually, I think there's a lot of concern, in fact, that there is almost too much developer interest in these naturally occurring affordable housing units that could end up actually jeopardizing whether it stays affordable long term. So I think that there could be an interesting opportunity here to also thinking about like, how can we better capitalize nonprofits that are going to be in a position to buy up some of the housing to ensure that it stays in the affordable range for the long term, rather than necessarily trying to get more developers interested in that kind of low range housing, because I think that there's increasing interest there because it's sort of been overlooked for so long that now people are starting to pay attention.
Yeah, you're exactly right. There's actually some really good work happening in Charlotte. I don't know if you've seen that, around how to do just that, like identifying the naturally occurring affordable housing that's about to come onto the market or is on the market, and helping purchase it so that it can stay affordable and renovate it. So if you haven't seen that, I'll send that to you, but it's really,
I would love to.
David, did
Ashley, we have a question from our good friend Larry James, who's the founder of City Square, and okay, so I'm just going to read this. I'm not editorializing. This is all Larry. Like face mask mandates, inclusionary zoning is illegal in Texas. How do we respond locally?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know enough about the situation in Texas to respond kind of authoritatively. I would say that inclusionary zoning hasn't had the best of track records in some cases, because what you end up having is, by mandating that there's affordable housing attached to sort of market rate or luxury housing, not a ton of units end up getting built. A lot of times developers, if there's an option to pay into a housing trust fund or something, they'll prefer to do that. But then it overall raises the cost of the housing getting built, which then makes the housing more expensive for people to be using in any case. So I think that there's sort of been like mixed evidence that like inclusionary zoning is going to be our answer for new developments, unless we did it on a massive scale where it was like a face mask mandate, where it's just like everywhere it had to be, you had to actually be providing this kind of affordable housing in every unit. I think that would be, a challenge to actually see that happening. And so what you end up seeing is, like in a lot of places, there is an opt-out, and very few affordable housing units end up getting produced that way. So I think that, this is the challenge of like, how do we get to more affordable housing also, is like, there is no one solution. Like, it would be great if it was like there was inclusionary zoning was just it. It's like we need some of that, but we also need all of these various other different tools to try to bring down housing prices, and to kind of address, you know, our host of other housing issues that go along with it.
Mhm. No silver bullet.
Yeah.
That might be that might be the biggest the thing that really kind of on a meta level shows that your book is important is usually the best way to sell a book is be like, I have the silver bullet. You know, like in the airport, right? Buy this book and everything's solved. And you're very honest. You're like, no, there is no one solution. So
Right. Yes.
Well, because not everybody wants to live in one type of housing, right? So you have to have options.
Totally. Right. And I mean, also like the conditions that make sense in one place might not make sense in another. And like, also a lot of times we've seen how you might impose one new policy and there are unintended consequences. And if so, that was like your silver bullet forever. And there was a bunch of, you know, consequences that you hadn't really anticipated. That was a bad idea. Like, how do you then handle that? What new problem? So I actually think it's sort of like the safer bet of kind of, you know, attacking the problem from a bunch of different angles. Like trying to encourage housing diversity has to be a big part of it. Like making it easier for people to build the housing that they want to build needs to be a big part of it. Finding ways to sort of not subsidize the housing that we shouldn't be building, I think is also important. And properly putting in other incentives that like make it a lot more sense, right? The ones that are going to build more integrated, sustainable, affordable places, like those are the incentives we need to be getting behind.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're out of questions, Ashley.
Oh, I thought there's a one down there.
Oh, was there one more?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, it just popped up.
Alicia.
Yes, as our generation gets older and we no longer can afford single family homes, will there be improvements with assisted living and nursing homes? I think it's time for 50 somethings to be able to live in community. That's interesting because I don't feel like you did you address those issues in your book? I don't remember.
Yeah, I mean, so I don't really talk about assisted living and nursing homes, although I do think that, you know, one of the fascinating things is that we were able to build a ton of 55 plus communities because we made that a protected class that could be marketed to and specifically sort of, you know, you could effectively prohibit other people from living in that type of housing, which I think is just a fascinating thing that we did that as a society. And then the result is that there's tons of this kind of housing out there. Mm-hmm. And so I also wonder like how we might, you know, kind of take some lessons learned from that experience to think about like other styles of housing that we could, you know, effectively say, you know, this plot of land is going to be only for, say, wellness community or something like that also as well. Like that, some of those kinds of protections I think would be really interesting to see. As far as like improvements to nursing homes and assisted living, I think that what we're seeing just from the market side is that like the places that a lot of people want to live are in these kind of more accessory dwelling unit style homes or in, you know, with family members, and figuring out ways to be able to do that better is like a real challenge for folks. And that's, I think, where a lot of attention is getting put.
Yeah, like my grandmother earlier refuses to move into a senior living community and wouldn't even consider anything else because she's not old. I'm not old. I don't want to live with old people.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Yeah. So one last question in the chat box around the idea with multi-generation housing and pairing college students with seniors. what rights do the elderly maintain to evict a tenant
Mhm.
that doesn't uphold their side of the agreement? How do we protect them from abuse?
Yeah. Yeah. So, I don't know the sort of the exact terms of that. I would imagine it would be sort of similar to kind of traditional leases. And like with anything else, you would, the senior would be kind of in the process of kind of vetting who their housemate would end up being. So you would hope that they would be able to make some good judgments to avoid being in some kind of, in a bad spot there. I think that I would guess that those kinds of like negative possibilities is a small fraction of what would otherwise be a pretty good relationship between tenants and a homeowner. And I think, like any other co-housing situation, it's always a challenge figuring out like who's the right person to be living with you and where do you want to live and whatnot. But I think it certainly is an interesting opportunity for folks. So,
Right.
yeah.
We have a group here in Dallas that does shared housing similarly to this with seniors. So Rhonda, you might want to check out what they do. There's also a new company that's starting up called Roommate Me that I know they put into place kind of like a roommate agreement that both parties agree to before they would move in to share an apartment with each other. So I think there's a couple different ways to do it, and definitely always legal action if it's needed. So I think we're out of questions. Diana, this was fabulous. It was so good to have the conversation with you today.
Yeah.
I really appreciated our prep session too. We should have recorded that. This was fun. So, and I will definitely send out that Charlotte model to you. And just thank you again for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This is great. And just really appreciate the time to talk about these issues.
Yeah, and thanks for the book.
Yeah,
it's great.
Thank you both, Diana and Ashley. Ashley, you are amazing. You're an amazing interviewer. I'm going to give a quick commercial before I press the end button for our next hard conversation. It is going to be with the Dallas DA, John Crusoe. This is going to be September 15th, 2021, as usual at noon. It's going to be about how you can't arrest your way out of homelessness. And so you can find that on our website and register for it. And we hope all of you will join us. If you want to, we hope you will buy Diana's book. I also put into the chat the Think episode with her, which was the catalyst for me saying, we need to talk to Diana. So you can go ahead and listen to that interview from back in March. Thank you again, ladies. This was incredible. Everybody have a wonderful, wonderful rest of the day and a great rest of the week. Bye-bye now.